the advent of something called well-tempered tuning, which is the idea of trying to flatten out the carpet. We're going to spread out the difference of that wolf tone because it's too narrow. We're actually going to narrow all the other fits by just enough so that we can widen that one so it sounds all right. And so this is like on this side, here's a chart of an example of well-tempered tuning, where you can see these intervals. These bars represent how far you tune from a pure tone. So 0 represents a pure tone here. This bar right here represents how much you have to detune fifths by. These blue, if you look on the bottom of the blue, represents how far you have to detune fifths in order for it to, for you to play in this temperament. Equal tempered, which I'll talk about later, has all these bars at exactly that blue line that I can't really point at. And well-temperaments are so called because they're irregular. They're not all tempered. Not all intervals are tempered the same. So you can see that these ones are tempered, and these ones are left pure. These fits here, and this is really interesting because then, if you start on a certain note, you may get a scale that sounds slightly different than if you start on a different note. But what's really important is all these keys are playable. You can play in almost all these keys and earn all the keys, and it'll still sound tasteful. But composers use this to their advantage when they're writing pieces because a big important part of writing music was like setting up a suspension or a chord that would resolve to another chord. A dissonance resolving to a consonant is really the root. So some chords sound differently if I were to play, or sound more in tune than others. So playing this C major chord compared to if I played this B major chord, this interval is a little bit wider, so you get a different quality of sound out of that chord. So that a composer might have written something that used the dissonance of this of that chord to resolve to a more harmonious chord, or even something like that, where it goes from a harsher sounding chord to a more pure sounding chord, and that creates a greater effect in the music. So yeah, this is just an example of one temperament called the Vallotti-Young temperament, used in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And yeah, so in the beginning of the 20th century, we came upon something called equal temper tuning. Well, which had really been, the ideas for equal temper tuning had really been around since the late 16th century, but it really came into practice during the 20th century, the early 20th century. And that's the temperament that we use today, is equal temper tuning. And it's pretty much ubiquitous. Any piano that you play on when somebody tunes it is equal tempered, almost everywhere in the Western world. And the reason you use equal temperament is because it's very mathematical, and it works very well because every scale sounds exactly the same. All these intervals all the intervals are based on this 12th root of 2. So because if there are 12 tones in our scale, if you multiply the 12th root of 2 by itself 12 times, you get an octave, which is exactly 2. And then all the other tones, all the other 11 tones are figured out by, if you do the first 1 12th root of 2, 2 12th root of 2, 3 12th roots of 2. And it works very well because every scale has the same sound to it. Every scale is equally out of tune. So you can play a song in any key and it'll sound the same. Or you can play any song in any key and it would sound, there wouldn't be any two bad dissonances in one key compared to another. They would all be evened out. And if I were to play, it's all these chords have the same quality, timbre to them, compared to listening to just this one to this one. Some of them sound better than others. Some of them, the intervals are slightly differently arranged than others. But in equal temperament, all the intervals are precisely arranged according to these 12 roots of 2. And so it's great because it's so uniform. But at the same time, you lose the effect that composers sometimes used, or that they often used and relied on in writing their music in the past. So certain dissonances didn't resolve the same way to certain consonances. They don't do that in equal temperament as they would have, 400 years ago. make up for that with an equal temperament makes up for that by being uniform and equally playable in any key. So temperaments in music, this is where it all sort of ties together. The idea of a temperament is that it allows composers to play and modulate into pretty much into many more keys without the damaging sounds as you can hear in intervals like this, or if you listen to like chords like this one and this one here. By tempering the intervals by just a hair, you can't even tell the difference when you're just playing by single notes. But by tempering them just a tiny bit, either sharp or flat, you get a totally different sound out of the piano, one that allows you to play in a lot of different keys. And temperaments are primarily important in instruments that you can't really tune easily, like piano, pipe organ, marimba, xylophone, things, or chimes, instruments that are very hard to tune or you can't really tune on a regular basis. Whereas instruments that you can tune, say like a trombone, you have the whole range, any note you want to play that's on the slide, you can play it. Or say a string instrument where you can like pick, like a cello or a violin, you can pick any note on the fingerboard and press down and play right there. You can even change your temperament while you play. You can adjust your notes up or down, in effect tempering them as you play to make intervals more in tune than others. And to play out those consonances and dissonances the way that a composer would have written them to be played. And so, yeah, that's the great thing about temperaments is that as we continue to research the physics of sound, and as our music continues to evolve, and we demand the ability to play in different keys or more keys or fewer keys with more accuracy and better sound, we're going to continue to create temperaments that allow us to play in many keys with the same quality, with the better quality of sound overall, and ultimately leading to better sounding music for everyone. So, thank you for watching. Are there any questions?
Excuse me, interruption. Bruce Smith in the counseling office, please.
So, Miles, do I understand right that tuning the piano is really the art of having it on tuned correctly?
Yeah, that's the key thing. When you're tuning in these temperaments, you actually detune it slightly from a perfect sound in order to get it to sound better in other situations. It's counterintuitive. You'd think, oh, why not just put it in tune for everything? But when you put it in tune one way, it's out of tune in another way, and when you try to put it in tune that way, it's out of tune in the first way. And so the best compromise that we have so far is to pretty much put it in the middle so that it's equally out of tune both ways. But it works really well.
I got it, because I live in an old house, and if you put one picture this way, it looks crooked to that one over there. So you make them all crooked and they look good?
Yeah.
Only it's my sound. They might
Yeah. I see.
Actually, Miles, you talked about making the intervals different, but let's think in an orchestra. Like with the other instruments, would it be a problem?
Well, the cool thing about in an orchestra is that if you're playing, say, the harmony of in like a bass section or in a tenor section, then you can control, like you can bend the pitch. Like say on the flute, if you roll in a little bit, you can get the pitch to dip down a little bit. And as long as if your whole section plays that way, you can get it to be tuned. If one person is trying to play in a different tempo than everyone else, then it just sounds like everyone's out of tune. But it's sort of something that as you get into more and more advanced orchestras, that you pay attention to, especially on like the trombone, you pay attention to lowering, or raising certain intervals so they sound more in tune compared to other intervals. So I mean, in the orchestra, yeah, it's something that you can definitely practice, but it takes a lot of work. You need to have a very refined ear to be able to hear, right where it's in tune, or and you have to stay in tune with your section as well and the rest of the orchestra. So it takes a lot of practice. You have to listen very closely and listen very carefully. But if the whole orchestra is listening to itself and to all the other instruments in all the other instruments in their section in the rest of the ensemble, you can play very in tune and with a very great musical effect for the lifting those notes, off the page.
I noticed that you had a lot of like formulas, like you said, like Pythagoras came up with. I was wondering how they actually translated those into sound.
Yeah, all right, that's a good question. So when you're looking at, okay, yes. So sound waves is a cyclical, when you hear a pitch, it's a cyclical, repeating pressure wave, which is, as I was showing on these sine waves here, they're very cyclical. It's very, it's a steady pattern. And by controlling how fast that pattern repeats, you can control how high or low pitch the sound is. Now, what happens is when you're tuning by fits for, say, in the Pythagorean method of tuning, a perfect fit sounds when you're exactly at a 3-to-2 ratio between the frequencies. So this one is at, well, this is actually not a demonstration that I would use for that. Say this one right here. This signal right here is at 440. That corresponds to this top guy. And if I want to tune a perfect fifth, I would tune this slider. I would bring this up to here, and now I'm at 660 with the second frequency. So this cycle is exactly 3/2 the speed of this cycle. And you can see that if you look at every third, well, every 2 it repeats again on top. Well, let me stop it. It might be easier to look at. Okay, so here, these line up here, and you have 1, 2 here before it lines up again, and here you have 1, 2, 3 before it lines up again. And so this would correspond to a perfect fifth sound. And that's what Pythagoras did. He just tuned them in perfect fifths. And then to tune, say, by an octave, it would be exactly a 2-to-1 ratio. And I can't go any higher on this slider. But if I were able to shorten this one enough that I could fit 2 waves into the space of 1 here, that would be the same as tuning exactly an octave. And so you can tune up by fifths and then down by an octave, and then up by fifths and down by an octave, and then you can fit all of those notes into one scale. And so that's pretty much how Pythagoras, approached it. And that's pretty much the same approach that people use nowadays. Instead of using just fifths, they use other intervals like thirds, fourths, sixths, octaves, tenths, 17ths, and paying attention to also to counting how fast there are beats between those notes as well. So yeah, they're paying attention both to the purity of the sound and also how out of tune it is at the same time. Any other questions? All right, thank you for coming.